Thanks, Joe. It's a great pleasure to be here. It's a favour to Job, really, because Job's done a lot for Eurocontrol, a lot for safety, a huge amount for just culture. So there's been a huge source of support over many years, so it's the least I can do to repay the favour in a small way. So I'm a psychologist by background and human factors engineer. And I'm interested in people especially. People have always been my special interest since being a little kid. For this talk, I'm going to talk about people in control. So the idea of people being in control, to what degree are we in control, and who's in control of what. I'll also introduce you to this idea of the work that we imagine that people do and the work that people actually do. Just before I start, are any of you controllers or former controllers here? So we have a small number. Any of you engineers? Any of you safety engineers in particular, dealing with risk assessment and so on, risk management? A few of you. Some human factors specialists. Okay, psychologists specifically. Who else have I left out? A bunch of people. But that's interesting. So we've got quite a mixed audience. Not very many air traffic controllers, but lots of people with an interest in control, and lots of people with control over various different things. I think air traffic control is really interesting because it's one of the few professions that has that word control in it. Here we have, that's Heathrow Tower. I spent a lot of time there in the late 90s for the transfer to the new tower. I was involved in that as a human factors specialist. They have the A380, of course, of Qantas. That might be the one that Richard de Crespigny was flying. I think it was. I interviewed him for Hindsight. You can find that in one of the past magazines. And I was going to integrate that into the talk, but there wasn't really enough time. But if you read that article, just search Skybury, Hindsight, and QF32, you'll find a whole different slant on control there, and lots of different issues from engineering perspectives. Here we have a conductor and a violin player. And I guess the question here is, to what degree are controllers in control? To what degree are others, such as train controllers, signalers, marine traffic controllers in control? To what degree are pilots in control? To what degree are train drivers in control? You'd expect that those very close to the sharp end would be fully in control, would feel in control, and would have everything that they need in order to be in control. What we find in practice is that that's not always the case. The next issue of Hindsight magazine that will be released at the end of this year is on this title of People in Control. And you can see there's a question mark, because there is a question mark about, well, who are the people in control? What kind of control? And to what degree are they in control? And how do they stay in the loop? What kind of loop are they in? So you'll find a few articles on this, but in my editorial to the issue, I list 9 principles for people in control. And they mirror some previous principles that were released by Charles Billings in the 1990s with regard to automation. But I just want to focus on one of them, which is the 9th principle that I propose, is that people have some choice, control, and responsibility. And when you apply that to roles like train drivers, pilots, and so on, and even air traffic controllers, the word some can seem problematic, okay? Because I very deliberately put that there to show that people don't have full control. Agency is actually distributed among many and shaped by the opportunities and constraints of the context in which we exist, along with our capabilities and motivation. Let's explore a little bit further then who we're actually talking about when we talk about people. Those of you who are human factors specialists, probably most of your attention goes on these people, the operational staff, whoever they are. So here it would typically be air traffic controllers. They're sort of the centre of the universe when it comes to air traffic management, or at least I think they are. They're sort of the centre of the universe, and most of our attention as HF specialists, and many others, is aimed at them. Selection, training, design, and so on. Most of it's aimed at operational air traffic controllers. I also do work in the health care sector, so the equivalents there would be people like anaesthetists, surgeons, and so on. These operational people who are closest to where, let's say, harm can actually occur, or where successful outcomes are most immediate and most obvious. But if we take a zoom out a little, you've got a company, whether that's an air navigation service provider, or a hospital, or a train company, where you have all sorts of other functions. You have management, you have design, engineering, some of you are involved in that, some of you are safety specialists, some of you are involved in training, you might be involved in planning more generally. And all of your work will affect the work of those operational staff, especially the controllers and other operational staff. If we zoom out to the industry, then there are other players. So we've got the unions, the regulators, researchers, suppliers, insurers, and so on. We don't think quite so much about these in our day-to-day work. They're a little bit further out. And then we have society more generally, where we have the media and the government. The judiciary, that me and my colleagues do some work with around Europe. And then on the other side, usually close to operational staff, particularly, for instance, in the cabin of an aeroplane or in a hospital, you have the public. The point here is that all of these people are relevant to the work of operational staff in some way or other. So in your mind's eye, you can start to draw links, like an influence diagram, between all of these people. For instance, how does the government affect the work of the judiciary? How does the judiciary affect the media? Does the media affect the judiciary? How does the government affect the regulator? And the regulator therefore affect the company, and the company's decisions affect the operational staff. You can also then go in the other direction, because what if staff decide to go on strike or take some other kind of action that affects the company, which affects the industry, which affects society? So everything's affecting everything else all of the time. What I want to talk about now, though, is this idea of work. So when we talk about work, we typically don't really know what we're talking about because we're never clear. But we're all involved in work somehow. We have work as done, which is the work that people actually do. So it's real activity in the head and in the world with your hands, with your voice, and so on. But when we talk about work, we're not usually talking about that. So when we look at work as done, it's characterized by several things, such as it's highly variable. So the work that's done by an air traffic controller, by a train driver, by an anaesthetist, by a surgeon, is extremely variable. The same task, the same work is not really done twice in exactly the same way. Even if you drove here today, you didn't drive in exactly the same way as you did yesterday. The trajectory would be slightly different. There's also lots of trade-offs that characterize work. You're constantly having to trade off several different things. We hear of safety first, but in practice, it's not really first. Other things usually come first, or at least the pressure is usually to be more efficient, or the pressure is on capacity. The pressure might be on sustainability. There's many different goals that all sort of compete for attention, but fundamentally, there's a trade-off between efficiency and thoroughness, and that characterizes all human work. So we want to be efficient, we also want to be thorough. The message in organizations is usually to be more efficient, but when something goes wrong, the message is, you should have been thorough, at least on that occasion. So the paradox is, be efficient unless you should have been thorough, but you never really know when that is, at least not always, and not in advance. So work as done can look, if you observe the work of a controller in a tower, for instance, or you observe the work of an anaesthetist, it can look quite messy, quite variable. Anaesthetists, for instance, you'd think they all work in the same way, but it's as much of an art as a science. They work in quite different ways, using different drugs, different doses, in different ways of delivery, even for the same patient. Similar with air traffic controllers, when you observe them, they'll do different things given the same scenario. We don't solve things in the same way. But we might imagine that actually we do solve things in the same way. So the further you get away from the work of frontline operational people, the more you rely on imagination that's full of stereotypes and simplifications. So you form a mental model. We all have a mental model of what air traffic controllers do, for instance, what train drivers do, what surgeons do. You all have an idea, and what all of those ideas have in common is that they're fundamentally wrong in quite important ways. Even if you're an air traffic controller, the chances are you've not been an air traffic controller in all of the various disciplines. You've been an area controller, or an approach controller, or you've been a tower controller. Now you have a very good idea about what that type of control is, but only in your own context. So we rely on lots of stereotypes, simplifications, generalizations, and the further we are from the work, the more distance from reality is. In other words, there's a big gap between work as imagined and work as done. Work as imagined is not only though the work that we imagine that other people do, it's the work that we imagine that we do. I'll give you an example. So a new system is introduced and you think, okay, or you get a new car, how am I going to interact with this car? Well, I saw how Job interacted with a car this morning that had some automated functions, and it wasn't how he expected either. So we have an imagination about how things work, and then when it comes to actually doing it, we do things in a different way. Similarly, those of you involved in investigations will know that the way that controllers remember what happened during an incident is not necessarily the way that it did happen. Because memory doesn't work like a tape recorder. It works as a storyteller, a story maker, reconstructing a scenario that's plausible, that seems realistic, to the best of our memory, which is full of biases. There's also work as prescribed. So work as prescribed is what we should do according to the rules, the procedures, the checklists, the guidelines, the regulations, the laws. Whereas work as done is characterized by lots of variations, and work as imagined is characterized by millions of permutations that everybody imagines something different about how you work. There's only one work as prescribed, at various levels of abstraction, from the checklist that you used to the general regulation. But work as prescribed isn't necessarily how you work, because it's not possible to work exactly according to the rules all the time. If you did, that's usually called a white strike. It's a form of industrial action where you do only what's in the rules, and you find that the whole system comes to a halt. So in practice, rules are prescribed. Experts, like practitioners in frontline roles, they know which ones have to be done to the letter, and which ones act as more of a guideline, a framework. In different roles, such as on the flight deck, things tend to be done very much as prescribed in standard operating procedures. Air traffic control, less so, and then in other types of roles, much less so still. It doesn't mean you're breaking the rules, it just means that it's impossible to describe all of the different things that you do, and one of the reasons is because so much of it is in the head. It's hard to prescribe how you plan. It's hard to prescribe how you choose a solution among various alternatives. This work is disclosed. So now it gets more difficult because we have what you do, what you imagine, or what people imagine that you do, what you should do, and what you say you do. And those are four different things. What we say we do is limited by our memory, because we don't always know. It's limited by our ability to even know what we do. For instance, if I were to ask you where is the reverse gear in your car, you're probably having to think about it. You're making a mental image of the gear, and is it down there? No, it's a 6-gear car. Is it up here, or is it over there? If you've got two cars, now it becomes more difficult, which is it in which car? Where's the petrol cap? Is it on the left or is it on the right? And you don't know immediately because that knowledge is all automated. Once you get in the car and you put your hand on the gear stick, then you'll know. There's another reason why we don't disclose what we do, and that's because of fear. We don't disclose everything that we do because we fear there might be sanctions, or someone might take something away from us if we tell the truth about what we do. And so people won't always disclose everything that they do at work. We also have work as allies. So some of you work in safety assessment, some of you work in human factors, some of you might work in procedure design. For all of those types of roles, you have to take a job, pull it apart into separate pieces, and list the steps, the sequence, the timing, the conditionalities on all of those things. The more you do that, you get a fine-grained description of the work, but it starts to no longer look like the work. and it certainly doesn't feel like it to a controller. You show a controller highly detailed task analysis of all of the specific steps, and okay, it is the work, but it doesn't really feel like it because you've lost the whole in taking it apart into its components. There's the work as observed. So if you've observed people like controllers at work, or if you've observed anyone at work, well, you think you're observing the work, but really you're observing just what you can see. You're observing physical actions. Now, if I were to go and just observe your area controllers here, because I don't know enough about the area control here, it's not going to make that much sense to me, compared to if I were to observe in a tower, for instance, where there's more observable signs in the world. I can see people's head movements and so on. But I can't observe what's going on in someone's head, and much of the work is done in the head as well. And also I can only observe one thing at once. So while I look at this controller here, I can no longer see this controller here. But I might not realise that my observation is actually quite partial. This work is simulated. So now we're getting close to the real thing, and we like to think that at least simulation is its actual work. It's like the real thing. But you can't simulate the feeling of there being some kind of danger. If you're in a hospital simulation, for instance, you know that there's no real person on the table. If you're in an air traffic control simulation, you can't reproduce the feeling of the team, the supervisory arrangements, and so on. There are some things that you can simulate, and there are some things you can't. And the things that you can't simulate are sometimes the really important things. Then this work is instructed, so now this is how you're taught to do your job, whether that's as a controller, as a pilot, as a train driver, or somebody else. You soon realise when you get into operations that there's another layer of teaching that goes on, and that's the real job. That's when you arrive in the ops room. That's when you arrive in the flight deck or in the operating theatre. It's not that what you've been taught is wrong, but it's not always going to apply, and now it's going to get more variable. And then this work is measured. So there's measures about all sorts of work. In the cockpit, lots of different things are measured. In the control room, lots of things, but fewer. In a hospital, fewer still. But you can't measure everything. You can measure a very small amount of the actual work. You can't measure anything that goes on inside of the head. So you can measure things like RT occupancy. But you can't measure the mental processing that goes on in order to produce some kind of response on the RT. And then finally, just in this model, we have work as judged. So these are the judgments that we make around work. Okay? So how do we judge people's work performance? Well, we have to rely on all of these other things that I've already discussed. So work as judged it relates to work as done, but there's all sorts of biases in judgment. There's all sorts of subjectivity involved in making a judgment, whether that's a judgment as an examiner, a competency examiner, or whether that's a judgment as a judge or a jury. And then finally, there's lots of contextual factors that affect all of these things. So we have work as done that's affected by the temporal or time-based context, the physical context, the technological context, the informational, and so on. But you have all of these, I call them proxies or substitutes for work as done. These proxies are also influenced by all of those different contexts as well. For instance, work as observed is limited by the physical environment. It depends on what you can observe. You can't observe everything. The work as disclosed will be influenced by the social and cultural environment, because your team will somehow make clear what you should and should not say. Let's just go back to work as done. With each of those, you can see that there's some kind of overlap. So there's an overlap between how we imagine people do work and how they actually do work, but it's not complete. Most of work as done, as I've said, we don't really understand. We can't really imagine it, because we're not doing that role. If you've done that role, there'll be a bigger overlap. But there's also things that we imagine about how people work that are simply not true. They don't reflect the reality of work, or at least not for everybody. Now, what sometimes happens, of course, is things go wrong, and this term human error is used to describe almost as a cause for when things go wrong. That was the subject of my whole PhD quite a long time ago, looking at human error from different kinds of perspectives. So here we have some kind of mistake, some kind of error happens in work as done that was never imagined before, or at least is not commonly imagined. It's a surprise. It's a surprise event that something's gone wrong. It could also be that you have an error where everybody knows this happens. For instance, readback errors, that's common. Hearback errors by controllers, where the controller does not detect the incorrect readback, is less common, but it still happens, okay, for various reasons. Typically, the controller will expect a correct readback because the correct readback happens about 97 times out of 100. And so it's efficient not to pay too much attention to the readback, such that you've got some attention left over to pay elsewhere. Remember the efficiency-thoroughness trade-off. If you want to pay complete, thorough attention to the readback at all times, that's going to make you less efficient on the job. And so you ration your attention over different things. You keep a listen of it, but meanwhile you're on to the next task in your mind and you're looking at something else. There's a book by Matthew Syed. He's a British journalist, writer, but he was, I think, Olympic table tennis player at the time. He wrote this book called Black Box Thinking about performance, about human performance, and he said society as a whole has a deeply contradictory attitude to failure. So even as we find excuses for our own failings, we're quick to blame others who mess up. So these are these errors in work as done that we perhaps imagine don't happen, or at least shouldn't happen. So let's just have a look at judgment then for a moment. So we have work as done, and what we imagine is that we have work as done, and that's the basis for work as judged, so we make a judgment based on the work, right? Again, whether you're a competency examiner, whether you're a prosecutor, whether you're a judge, whether you're a member of the public reading a newspaper article, we judge the work that people do. But that's not quite right. What really happens is a bit more complicated. So again, we have work as done, but it's represented in these various proxies that I've already described, okay? Because work as done, it's been and gone. It's sort of ephemeral. It's there, and then it's gone in seconds. You have no access to it, again, because most of it happened in the head. It was not recorded. Even if you have ambient voice recorder in the control room, you cannot record what was going on in the thinking behind that, the reasoning, the rationale. What about what was not said? That's not recorded, of course, because it wasn't said. Why was it not said? Was it forgotten? Did somebody decide not to? We don't know. Now, these proxies inform our work as imagined. Okay? So you're trying to judge someone's work. You were not there, you didn't experience it, you didn't do the work, but you've heard about it from these various different proxies here. And now you've got an imagination about what happened. You've read the newspaper report, you've read the accident inquiry report, whatever it is. Now, on the basis of your imagination, you make a judgment. So what we don't realize is when we're judging people's work, what we're doing is judging our imagination. And we're all judging different things, because all of our imaginations about what happened are different. But we can't really specify how they're different. But we all have an opinion. So that's quite sort of shocking, so it's more like that. Work as judged is based on work as imagined. If you want to just learn a little bit more about this, there's an article that I'll show you, but let's just look at work as done for a moment. It's very time pressured for operational tasks by definition, usually. It's very hard to put any kind of tasks on hold because you're moving usually, or something's moving at speed, even if it's a situation like a patient, or whether it's a train, or it's an aircraft. The consequences of failure are acute, and they're usually immediate. The outcome is unknown at the time that you're doing the work, and hindsight is by definition unavailable because you've not seen the consequences yet. So that characterises work as done. It's the here and now, and we're looking forward. In the work that many of us do, though, we're looking at analysing work, we're imagining work, we're judging work. It's not very time pressured. It's possible to put tasks on hold. You can go and have a coffee whilst you're doing an incident investigation. the consequences of failure of that investigation are unclear. What if you get the analysis wrong? What if the conclusions are wrong? What if the recommendations are not very good? The outcome is known, and hindsight is available, which means you know everything that happened, in as much as you understand from the various proxies that you've got, the work is disclosed and so on. So here, you're there and then, and you're looking back. Two totally different contexts. So in one of the last Hindsight magazine, which was 35, this was on just culture, you can see a little bit more of a description about why judgment is so difficult in getting from work as done to work as judged. And if you want to, you can, I've provided these here, there's a URL where you can print these out. I printed them out as beer mats, coasters, stickers, and all sorts of things that you can actually use in workshops to look at the relationships, the influences, and so on. You'll find that on the URL there, or later you'll have access to the slides. Well, let's move to human error now, before we look at a case study that's very revealing. Human error was the subject of my PhD, so as I said some years ago, and one of the difficult things, it's really hard to find a definition of what human error is. You end up with something like it's the commission or omission of a human action, or a psychological state, or an activity which is inappropriate in light of personal expectations, intended behaviour states, prescribed written or unwritten rules or norms, others' evaluations, or potential or actual outcomes. That's a really poor definition, because there's lots of things here that are not objective. Some of them are about you as a person, some of them are about others. So our referent for human error might be yourself. If I make a mistake, then I might define it as such. Or I might do something that's not a mistake to me, but you think that it is. Or vice versa. So human error is, as a definition, you might say someone did something that they were not supposed to do according to someone. That's a definition that you cannot really argue with, if that makes sense. It's not a very good one, though, for a PhD. Or someone did not do something that they were supposed to do according to someone. But that's the truth. Can't argue with that. But we all make honest mistakes. We all make these mistakes. So things happen to all of us that are partly predictable. And I say they happen to us because we're not even in control of it. We know, if we look at neuroscience and so on, that many of the ways we're behaved are fairly hardwired. We have much less choice and control than we imagine in many aspects of our behaviour. But especially when we make mistakes, such as we don't always detect or identify things. We don't always see things that we should see, or hear things that we should hear. We don't always perceive or interpret information accurately. We don't remember information accurately. We don't remember things that we've done or things that we wanted to do. If you've ever walked from one room to another and thought, why am I here? That's a very common phenomenon, a sort of liminal phenomenon of going through a doorway. And the act of going through that doorway means you lose your intention along the way. We don't always project information in time or space, whether you're a driver or a pilot or an air traffic controller. We make basic errors in this because we don't understand all of the conditions that are going to affect our projection, our judgment. We don't always make decisions that turn out to be as we would want. We don't always say or do things in the way that we would want to either. Again, sometimes you'll find air traffic controllers, they'll listen to the tape. They can't believe they said it. They don't know why they said it. It was a slip of the tongue or some other reason. Again, how we or others would like, at least in hindsight. So for my PhD, that was basically the topic of study. So I published at the time a few papers of errors of memory, errors of perception. If you're really a geek and you really want to find out more about that, it's the top right paper that's probably the best one to look at, because that's a sort of state of science paper on human error. Also quite useful to look at is the ICAO Doc 10151. So I was on this working group a few years ago, task force on human performance. It says to regulators, but you can ignore that. They do have, though, a few principles that might be of interest. So people's performance is shaped by their capabilities and limitations. So that's fairly obvious. There are some things that we are very limited in doing. There are other things that we have great capabilities in doing. But fundamentally, everything has limits. People have limits, machines have limits, organizations have limits. We interpret situations differently, and we perform ways that make sense to us at the time. This is called in psychology the local rationality principle sometimes. It means that people do things that make sense to them at the time, given their goals, expectations, knowledge, focus of attention, those kinds of things. Nobody does anything that makes no sense to them at the time, unless there's some kind of chaotic situation, in which case people just try anything. It doesn't make sense to them, you're acting semi-randomly. Apart from that, which is quite rare, people always do things that make sense to them, and the task is to find out why it did, in hindsight, when it didn't. People adapt to meet demands of the work environment, so we're constantly adapting, we're constantly adjusting. If you've ever, I walked through this morning through Paris Gare du Nord station. I took a little video, it's not in here, but I just took a little video of myself walking the very chaotic scene of people crossing, within centimetres of each other. So if you ever go through Amsterdam, especially where you're crossing between two parts and you see that, just take a moment to look and appreciate at how few people collide. What's amazing is that people hardly ever even touch each other. So that's really amazing, right? Because if you were an alien coming down from some place out of space, and you tell them you've got all of these people, okay, we've got all of these people, they're totally untrained, most of them don't know where they're going at different speeds, okay, how many collisions are you going to have between people? And they're going to vastly overestimate the number, similarly with driving. What we're amazingly good at is constantly adjusting and adapting to make sure that things go well. We do this by making risks and make trade-offs, and we do that constantly. But we're influenced by lots of things. We're influenced by other people, we're influenced by technology and the environment, including the organisation that we're in. Before I go on to the case study, what about willful violations and destructive acts? Because if you've looked at the definition of just culture that's in European regulation, you'll see that it mentions these terms. Well, certainly in my experience, procedural non-compliance, where people don't comply with the procedures, it's mostly adaptive, it's purposeful, it's for a good reason, and it's aimed at effective operation of the system. That's the vast majority of cases of non-compliance that you're going to see. People are trying to do the right thing in the best interest of the organisation. It's sometimes due to time saving or effort saving, personal gain, conformity, or obedience. Sometimes that happens as well. Rarely is it due to willful negligence, extremely rarely. And then anything such as destructive acts, such as sabotage, are extremely, vanishingly rare security incidents. That's the theory part. I want to go now to this derailment that happened at Santiago De Compostella. Do any of you remember this? It happened in 2013. So I remember it really clearly. It was in July. It was just after my daughter's birthday. And it was a really shocking incident, but I'll start, before I go into the details, with this quote from sociologist Charles Perrow in 1984. He wrote a book called Normal Accidents, and the premise was that accidents, given that we live in society that makes huge demands with technology, accidents are normal, or at least they should be. They're to be expected. And he said that we explain the unusual event by invoking the usual, and then proclaiming it to be different when of course it's not. He said instead it's the obscure, accidental, even random concatenation of normal disorders that produces a great event that we assume must have had great causes. What he's saying there is that what we usually think is if you have a big accident like Überlingen, or like any of the major accidents that you know from time, you think, well, there must be a big cause because there was a big outcome. A lot of people died. It must have a big cause. He's saying that's not true. That's not true. There's no correlation between the size of the cause and the accident. What you find in accidents is there's just lots of things that go wrong that have been there all of the time. They've been there, typically they were there, it's how things have always been done. Just so happens that on one day, as you saw with Überlingen, things aligned in a particular way. But it may never have happened again. It may never have happened out with that one scenario, that one event. Santiago de Compostella accident was one of these. What I want to do first is go through some basic facts. There's quite a lot of detail here that you're going to need to understand to know what really happened. So it was July the 24th, 2013, and it was a high-speed train going from Madrid to Ferrol. So it's going up into the northwest of Spain on a high-speed line. The train derailed at 176 kilometers per hour on a bend just outside the railway station of Santiago de Compostella, where the permitted speed was 80 kilometers per hour. So it was massively over the speed limit. All 13 cars derailed. The derailment resulted in the direct deaths of 79 people and left 145 injured, including the train driver. There was material damage to the train, of course, the railway infrastructure, and to passenger belongings. If we were to analyse this, I'm just going to go through in a few slides some more details. So we have the primary individuals we need to know about. There's some of the stakeholders in terms of organisations, the technical systems, the regulations, management systems and documents, and the geographical context. So all of those things are very important to understand. So I'm going to go through some of those just now. The primary individuals included the train driver, Francisco José Garzón Amon. You'll see in the accident report, which I'll show, the legal judgment I'll show later, his name is just sometimes summarised FJGA, and he was the train driver. Also is the former director of safety at ADIF, which is the infrastructure operator. Now, these are the two people that were prosecuted in the end for this event. Now, the prosecution took a course over several years, ultimately taking 11 years to reach its conclusion. These two were the only people prosecuted. That changed a little bit over time with various stages of the prosecution in different courts and so on. Various other stakeholders. So Renfe was the railway operator that operated the train involved in the accident. There was ADIF, which was the infrastructure operator responsible for construction, maintenance and operation of the network as a whole. So every country quite often has a separation between the train operating company and the infrastructure company. Similar with airlines and ATC in a sense, or airports. And then there was DGIF, that's the government agency, the sort of the regulator, let's say, responsible for oversight of the railway infrastructure safety, and it issued authorizations for all new lines and systems. A UTE is sometimes referred to in the documents, and that's a consortium responsible for the signalling system, which is very relevant to this particular case. There's also an independent engineering consultancy, INECO, I-N-E-C-O, that conducted technical assessments of the railway system. So we'll come back to some of those. But you also, of course, have the victims and their families, the general public, the judicial system, and the insurance companies. One of the first things that you do as a human factors specialist, at least I find useful, is to do a stakeholder analysis. So who are the people involved here? Again, not just the front line. We have the driver in this case. But remembering that stakeholder map early, we have the director of safety, we have the train operating company, we have the infrastructure company, we have various other players, going all the way back to the general public. A few technical systems. ASFAT is an automatic braking system, so it's a point protection system, so it uses trackside beacons that are passed by the train to enforce speed restriction at specific locations. There's also another system, a Europe-wide system called ERTMS. This is a much more modern rail control system. It's continuously monitoring and controlling train speed using radio communication. It's not relying on fixed beacons. CMS is the control command signalling, and that's a structural subsystem for controlling train movement, signalling and so on. And then as we go to the regulations, it's also important just to highlight a few of these. So we have the CVM, which is a speed table. That's telling the train driver of the maximum permissible speeds for different sections of the railway line. Very important tool for the train driver because you need to know how fast you can go. This is, let's say this is a safety management system, the SGSC. And there's also these technical specifications for interoperability. These are some EU regulations. We've got technical standards for railway systems to ensure interoperability and safety across different national networks. Now, that's all of the detail that you sort of need to know to understand the case, and we have the equivalent of all of those in air traffic management, so you'll probably have some knowledge that you can use. Now, where is the actual train line? It's up there in the red dot in the very far northwest of the country. And this is the curve. You can already see that we have a high-speed section of track here. The speed of the train at this occasion was 195, or around 190, 191 kilometres per hour on this section of track. Then you have a tunnel, and then there's a very sharp bend. And you can see the nature of that bend. It's quite a severe bend, and that's where the crash scene happened. We sometimes talk about first and second story in safety. So over time, different stories are revealed, and the first story is usually focused, it appears very quickly after the event. It's highly personalised, so it's focused mostly on sharp-end actors. It's quite low in context, and it's low in complexity, and for all those reasons, it's highly newsworthy. It's the kind of story you see the day after the accident, especially in the red-top newspapers. And it appears easily preventable and fixable if only the person did their job. Everything would have been okay. This is the driver on the day.
This is the phone call made by the driver of a high-speed train minutes after it crashed in Spain. Francisco Garzon's in shock. His voice is shaky and he is gasping for breath as he surveys the wreckage in Santiago de Compostela.
Sí, porque es que la tenía tarde y me despisté y ¿cómo se llama? Y tenía que pasar a 80 y pasé a 190 o algo así. Es que esto ya lo dije de seguridad, ya que eso era peligroso. Entonces nos íbamos a despistar y nos lo íbamos a tragar.
While admitting straight away he was going well over the speed limit, the driver says he had already complained the curve in the track wasn't safe.
Ay, Dios mío. Pero esto ya no tenía listas de seguridad, que eso era muy peligroso. Somos humanos y se nos puede pasar. Es que esto es inhumano, esta curva. Dios mío, pobres viajeros. Ojalá no haya ningún muerto.
Garzon hasn't talked about this in court, where he is charged with the homicide of 79 people and numerous offences of bodily harm. The revealing audio released by the Spanish daily El País bolsters the serious questions over signalling and security systems on the country's high-speed network, and whether anything was done between the complaint and the crash.
It's quite shocking coverage, and I remember seeing that, and I used those lines in the first line of an article that I wrote called Human Error, the Handicap of Human Factor, Safety and Justice. You can see in his voice and what he said there that he's clearly very devastated about what happened. It turned out that he was very traumatized by it. He cared about his passengers. He said that we warned them about this, that this curve was inhuman and so on. These are some of the headlines that happened subsequently that we saw. So the driver told the judge he was distracted, he admitted speeding, he got warnings, he was warned. He wrote on Facebook about high speed. These are the kind of headlines that happen and tell a really different account. So what happened here was the driver actually wrote on Facebook on his personal page, wouldn't it be great to set off a radar speed camera? Because it was roadside, because of the cars. It's just a joke, it's nothing to do with trains. But the media, this is actually The Guardian, which is quite surprising that it happened there, the media painted a picture that this person was somehow reckless, which was definitely not how his colleagues saw him. Human error as blamed. Even some of the most senior people in the region blamed the driver almost immediately. The driver's acknowledged his mistake. July 2013, the same month, that's the Galicia regional government president. Reasonable grounds to think he may have a potential liability, the Interior Minister. Regardless of the system in place, the drivers know the speed limits. If these are respected, the accident should not take place. So you can start to see already that the driver is being framed for what happened. It's the only cause. It's the only cause that this driver error says a report. So the accident investigation report indeed confirmed that driver error was the cause. The cause was excessive speed. Well, that's sort of stating the obvious. The driver was in breach of the requirement of the timetable book for the train and the maximum speed. The driver was distracted by answering an internal telephone. So you can see where the inquiry ended in terms of its sort of conclusions. What's quite interesting when you look at this initial report is that recommendations go much wider. It doesn't recommend sacking the driver, even just stopping phone calls. The recommendations were much more thorough. But the European regulator for railways, the ERA, denounced the report and said that it was not done sufficiently with to the appropriate standard of what it should be. So this first story focus is the driver was going too fast. He was distracted by a phone conversation with the inspector. Okay, the phone call lasted 100 seconds, which is a long time when you're going at 191 kilometers per hour. What was the phone call about? The phone call was because there was a family on the train that had another train to catch, and so they wanted to pull into a particular platform so that I guess they could go to the adjacent platform in order to catch the other train. That's all it was. It wasn't a necessary phone call, but it happened. And it's probably a normal kind of phone call. It did happen. But there's another story that happens which emerges slowly after a long delay. There's much lower personalization, much higher context, higher complexity, and for all of those reasons, it has much lower newsworthiness. It's very hard to report on a very complex story. People don't have the appetite. We're generally not interested. It's more of a book than a newspaper article, and it's a book read by fairly few people, and there's no easy prevention or remediation. This is 2017 now, and the Spanish judge, not the eventual judge, but at this stage of the proceedings, said there's sufficient indication that as far as ADIF, that's the infrastructure operator, is concerned, not everything was done to reduce the risks. ADIF had not fulfilled its role in evaluating the inherent risks in the circulation, generating and tolerating a situation of risk which finally crystallized in the accident. So now we're going much further back. The focus there is not really on the driver, because I guess we might assume that that could happen to other drivers if it happened to him. And now the headlines in 2016 and 2017 are different. It says that 80 were killed there because one person did die after the event, but it was found finally that it was not associated with the crash, that it was somehow independent. This was an interesting article because I saw this 2 days, I think it was, after. And this was a Spanish journalist that said, even this was 2 days after, this train crash was human error over decades, not just seconds. Quite rare to see an article like that. He even questioned, why was there a high-speed rail at this part of the country? Why the rush? Why was the bend curved in the way it was? Why was there such a severe curve? He suggested that it would have been extremely expensive to straighten the curve out, which would have been the safer thing to do. But there was a rush to open this section of track. And now the safety director is charged also. So mistakes were made, but are the errors of workers done? Or are they actually errors of workers imagined? Or both? And what's the balance? So the second story, we can say that Renfe provided inadequate guidelines for handling calls. So there were some recommendations, but they were just that. It wasn't clear what a driver should do if they received a call. The line was equipped with ERTMS and ASFA. Remember, the ERTMS is based on the movement of the train. It monitors the constant movement of the train, so it's a much more reliable system. The ASFA is based on just specific points. It's not monitoring the train, it's just monitoring its passage over specific points. So it's a backup, mainly enforcing signal aspects. ERTMS was not active on the entire line, and the section where the accident occurred relied solely on ASFA. So we've gone from a section of track where you have constant monitoring of the train to a section of track where you have to brake to 80 kilometers per hour, and you no longer have that constant monitoring. You're reliant on this backup system or this ASFA. So this lack of ERTMS increased the risk of speeding. Had ERTMS been active or ASFA beacons present, the train speed would have been automatically controlled, likely preventing the accident. So there's the other thing. There were no ASFA beacons at this particular point of the track. What that means is there was nothing to stop the train apart from the driver. So now we're in a difficult situation because we found that this ERTMS system is not reliable enough. So what do? We give the job to the train driver instead. Now, that first story and second story come from a report on medical error by, he's now departed, but by Richard Cook, who was a safety scientist and anaesthetist, David Woods and Charlotte Miller. And they talked about the first and second story. I'm going to propose a third story, which is the legal judgment. This is the officially sanctioned story. So this is merged very slowly after a very long delay, 11 years. Very highly personalised again, like the first story, but high context and high complexity, like the second story. Fairly low newsworthiness outside of Spain. The chances are you've not heard of this legal judgment. If you lived in Spain, you would have done. Now we're reliant on legal remedies. So we've got a bit of a paradox here. It's very complex, very contextual, but it's also very personalised. Because as a society, we do need someone to point to, at least in law. So that's 11 years later. The actual report, the judgment, is in Spanish, so I just translated it to English for the purpose of this. And now the train driver and head of safety were convicted. The main arguments in their defence were the driver admitted to being distracted, entering a curve at high speed, but he attributed his distraction to a phone call from a colleague and argued that the train operating company provided inadequate guidelines. The director of safety at the infrastructure operator, his defence centred on the argument that ADIF had followed established procedures and that the primary responsibility for speed control rested with the driver. The prosecution, both defendants were charged with 79 counts of reckless homicide, 43 counts of reckless injury. The prosecution argued that the driver's distraction led him to enter a curve at excessive speed, causing the derailment. The safety director was accused of failing to adequately assess and mitigate the risks associated with the curve despite knowing about its potential danger. This now brings all of us who are involved in safety assessment into the legal arena, at least in Spain. They were both found guilty. They were each sentenced to 2.5 years and 1 day in prison. The driver was disqualified from driving, not that he's ever going to drive again. He actually became a railway maintenance person for the intervening years once he partially recovered from the trauma. The safety director was barred from holding any position related to safety at the same period. If we go back to this diagram, we can do a small analysis to sort of finish off. These are some of the key things that contributed now to this accident that we've heard about. So one of these is risk management concerning this European rail traffic management system disconnection, this highly advanced system that would have stopped the train. Why was it disconnected? Well, there were several incidents in 2012, the year before before the derailment. They found that it was braking when it shouldn't, it was not working properly. Renfe, this is the train company, raised concerns about its reliability and requested its disconnection. ADIF, the infrastructure company, decided to disconnect the RTMS on these trains and operate solely under ASFA. Remember, there's no beacon at this particular point, but this was a general decision. ADIF did not reassess the residual risk after this disconnection. So those of you in risk assessment now will start to be nodding and shaking your head. ADIF included no human factors integration regarding the impact on driver workload, vigilance, error, or safety. Those of you that are human factors say, they're thinking, surely human factors, please tell me human factors was involved in this decision. ADIF did not continuously monitor and review the risks associated with this disconnection. Those of you in safety management will be thinking of that process of continuous review. Why did it happen? Why did it not happen here? So we have workers imagined driver error recognised as a potential risk, assumption that existing measures were sufficient, prescribed reliance on the signage, the maximum speed table, and on ASFA to avoid overspeeding generally on the line, where ERTMS was disconnected. No human error analysis. So those of you involved in human factors, you would know that if you're introducing something as complex as this, you need to do a task analysis, and you need to look at the possibility for error at critical tasks. Basic thing. No targeted observation. Who observed the train drivers to see this task in practice? You observed to see that it's realistic to expect a reasonably trained train driver to stop as imagined at this point. There's no evidence of that. There's no simulation, no targeted training, no human factors in the training. So you can see that none of the things that you would recommend should be done, must be done. They weren't done. If we look at speed reduction at this particular curve, the speed reduction at this curve was classed as a change in section speed rather than a permanent speed limitation. Now that seems like, well, what's the difference between that? It has huge implications. There's reliance now on one trackside sign placed 43 metres after the speed reduction began. So imagine, the only thing that gives you information that you've got to stop is your knowledge, okay, what's written in the book, and one sign. He spent 5 seconds looking away and he missed the sign. No pre-announcement, no announcement limitation, end of limitation sign. So on a permanent speed limitation, where you have a permanent speed limitation, you would have all of these things. Lots of opportunities for you to be informed. It's not there because it was classed as a section speed change. Now it gets quite interesting, because what this is here, we have a compartmentalised approach for risk assessment between the various organisations, and that's often where things will fall through the cracks. If you're responsible for the equipment, you do the assessment of your equipment. Is it reliable? Does it perform to the safety standards? You're not doing a holistic assessment of the human in the loop. There was a flaw in the infrastructure operator's understanding of the risks associated with significant speed changes where continuous speed control systems, ERTMS, were absent. So they were not really understanding now the picture for this curve. But the mandated technical specifications for interoperability required adherence to certain standards that required focus on technical performance. That was all done. The regulations were complied with, and there was safety authorization from the line. So from the regulatory point of view, the boxes were ticked, but no one imagined that really this could happen. Let's have a look next then at the phone call. Here we have various different contextual influences. So we've got a phone call that you know lasted around 100 seconds. Lack of attention to the track on the driver's behalf. Now what the judgment said is that no reasonable driver should behave like this. No reasonable driver should be on a phone call for 100 seconds. Now that's quite difficult to argue with, okay? Because if you think of a lorry driver that's looking away from the road for 100 seconds, you would say that's definitely neglectful. But a train is not like a road. You can't come off the rail very easily until you hit a curve. Also, if you look at the psychology of time, our time perception is not the way that we imagine. And 100 seconds doesn't feel like that. It's also easy to get sucked into a task and lose track of a time. Different people perceive time in different ways as well. We don't know how he perceived the time. There were concerns about the phone calls not being formally addressed. Now, this is a real lesson to all of us. He said that there were concerns. There were concerns about the curve. There were also concerns about what do we do if we get a phone call, okay? But they were not reported formally. So there was no official sign of them. So that's now problematic for the train drivers. They did what controllers do if they could. They did what others do. They just informally said, we've got a problem with this. They didn't want to necessarily fill in a safety report, a voluntary report. And it was not formally regulated. So we have the driver distraction, but it was a known safety concern. We've got no clear guidelines. It did just say in some guidelines, ensure that it can be done without risk, limiting conversation to what's strictly necessary. The driver and colleagues have raised concerns about this lack of clear guidelines. So that's the picture, and this was a key part of the prosecution. How reasonable was it to spend 100 seconds on a call about something that was not safety related, that it was not important? So I'm coming to the end now, but the question here is who is really in control? How much control did that driver have? He had control over a matter of seconds. How much control did others have, such as the Director of Safety, all of the safety engineers, all of the regulators, and everyone else? How much time did they have for their decision making? Who was involved in the decision making? Going back to this report, A Tale of Two Stories, what Cook, Woods and Miller said was safety is an emergent property of the ways in which the technical, individual, organisational, regulatory and economic factors join together to create the settings in which events, best ones and the worst ones, occur. That's what we've seen there. There's even economic implications for why all of those decisions were taken. They also say success and failure are derived from the same sources. Bad events are not separate phenomena that can be eliminated by the use of some managerial or technical tools. Our ability to vary our performance, to adjust, to make trade-offs, to make compromises, to be flexible, to be creative, to adjust and adapt. That's all of the reasons why we're successful in everything we do. They're also the reasons why we sometimes fail, but quite rarely. Just a couple of words now about, because this happened in Spain, this is not necessarily what would happen here or anywhere else. So in Spain, within the legal context, it was judged that this was a case of professional manslaughter through recklessness. At least where I'm from in the UK, that probably wouldn't happen according to what the Crown prosecutions say. So they say that mistakes, even very serious mistakes and errors of judgment, even very serious errors of judgment, are nowhere near enough for a crime as serious as manslaughter to be committed. What is required is that the jury are assisted sufficiently to understand how to approach their task of identifying the line that separates even serious or very serious mistakes or lapses from conduct which was truly exceptionally bad. Such a departure from that standard of a reasonably competent doctor in this case that it's consequently amounted to being criminal. And in your own country, you'll have your own definitions and lines of what constitutes perhaps truly exceptionally bad or grossly negligent behaviour. I'm coming to the end now, but we've seen all of this before. I think when you saw the Uberlingen, if you saw this example, you saw that it was not a first of a kind. There were sort of warnings, there was precedents. This is from the Ladbroke Grove Rail Inquiry, a major accident in the UK. This is from the Right Honourable Lord, sorry, this is a British thing, so we have all these titles, Lord Cullen. And these were from some of the recommendations from this rail inquiry. And if you read some of those, they pretty much all apply to what we've just seen. Okay. Has human factors been considered? Well, no, it wasn't. Has risk assessments been undertaken concerning task changes? And so, no, it wasn't. Is the presumption of driver error as a sole cause in investigation? Yes, there was. Can information be communicated without fear of recrimination? We're not sure. It wasn't really formally done. Is human factors incorporated in driver training? No, it wasn't. Are investigators trained in human factors? We don't know, but we can make an assumption based on the evidence. Now, if you want to find out any more about those proxies and work that's done, I have a blog that I do in sort of my spare time when I have any, called humanisticsystems.com. You can, this is a sort of album, you can have a look at all of these various proxies in more detail. And if you're really geeky, you can go into some sort of archetypes of how these can look in practice, but just go for the blog for that. Otherwise, you might be interested in Hindsight magazine. The last issue was on this question of just culture, and there's a previous issue on justice and safety, and otherwise you have lots of other issues, which release once or twice a year, depending sometimes on my time and energy levels. And I'll just finish with this thing, that if you don't remember anything else, then hopefully this will stay in your head as a sort of guide. So, does design and management make it easy for things to go right, hard for things to go wrong, and extremely hard for things to go extremely wrong? And if it's easy for things to go wrong, then that's primarily a problem of design and management, not of operational frontline performance. And that's all for me. So I'm sorry it's a little bit long, but I hope it kept you interested enough and you thought it was important enough to spend the time watching. So thanks a lot for your attention.